Okay, so we have started recording and we'll get going. So welcome everybody to the Lancashire and Cumbria Sensory Processing Education session. I'll just go to the next slide. So just a little housekeeping. So as I've mentioned today, the presentation will be recorded and we will share it with other parents and carers who couldn't make it today. It will be hosted on the local offer for the different local areas. So for everyone who is registered, they'll get the link emailed to them automatically. And for those who haven't registered, they'll be able to find it on the local offer. We're really, really sorry that we don't have time for questions and answers today. We thought it might be tight because we can only really do 2 hours and there's a lot of content to go through. However, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box and we will collate and answer them separately. If you're having any tech difficulties and need help, please contact my lovely colleague Alice Clegg. Her phone number is just there. Just in terms of if you can't see the presentation, sometimes it might be helpful to log out and then come back in. Often that is the best thing, isn't it? Or turning it off and on again. But Alice is there just if you need her. And if we have tech difficulties, please be patient. Like I said, this is the first time that we've done this before. So we're figuring out how it goes. And sometimes even when you have practiced, the IT demons are not kind. And just if you need to leave or step away at any point, that's absolutely no problem. Just, take care of your needs, turn your camera off if you need to. And as I said, if you can make sure your microphone is turned off as well. And I will definitely be looking out if you're struggling with that. So that's some housekeeping there. So I'll just introduce myself. So welcome everybody. I'm Alison May. So I'm from Morecambe Bay Clinical Commissioning Group and I'm a commissioner. And I have kind of organised this session, but it's been co-produced with lots of other people. So with Lancashire and Cumbria parents and carers, with occupational therapists who you will meet shortly in the next section, and local authorities. I would like to introduce everyone, but we unfortunately don't have time today. But just to say that even though I'm from Morecambe Bay CCG and the slides and the background say Morecambe Bay CCG, this is really a group and team effort from lots of people across the whole patch of Lancashire and Cumbria. So very, very grateful for everyone's cooperation and working together. So the plan for the session today is just a little bit of introduction and background information about why are we doing this. Then we're going to go into the presentation where we're going to talk a bit about understanding the language of sensory processing, and then some information about the senses and strategies to help parents and carers, some support for schools and some real life examples. So hopefully lots of useful information. And as I said, if you have any questions, please do type them into the chat box and we will collate them all and answer them at a later time. I'll also then do a little bit of a slide as to where you can go for more help. So because we're not able to answer individual questions, there are some resources across the patch that will be helpful for you in your local area, and they'll be able to signpost you. And then at the end of the session, there'll be a little handy resource list that you'll have emailed. I'll do a feedback sheet as well, just something really, really brief to find out a bit more about how you found the session, whether it was useful for you, what would be helpful. And then we'll either email some answers to the questions or we will cover them in the next session, which is in December, which is more about engagement and understanding more about your opinion. So this is a learning and education, and then the next session, which is planned for December, is more about, okay, so now you tell us and we'll listen to you. So, if you could just mute yourself if you've just joined, that would be great. Thank you. So just some background and context then as to why we're here today and what the session is. So we know across Lancashire and Cumbria there is a real postcode lottery of support for sensory processing needs, and it depends on where you live in the patch and what diagnosis you have as to what services you can have, what support you can have, if any, really. and we know that this basically isn't good enough. It's not very fair, it's not very equitable, and it's not meeting children's needs. It's not in line with the CERN Code of Practice. So we know that we need to do more. And this is one of the ways that we're starting to try and do more and address some of this postcode lottery. It's what we want to do is agree a bit of a strategic aspiration for meeting everybody's sensory processing needs. So at the moment, we know there's an issue, we know we need to do something about it, but we're not exactly sure what that is yet. So this is the first step to going on that journey, and what we're wanting to do over time. And with the next session is to understand more about what are the things we can do and how can we do it feasibly and realistically. And I'm going to say in advance, it's not going to be easy. It's absolutely going to be a massive job, especially across the whole patch as well. But it's the right thing to do. So I suppose it's just a reflection of where we're at, and being open and honest and saying that we're not doing the right thing at the moment, but we want to get there and we need your help to do it. It's also really, really important to note that Lancashire and South Cumbria, so not North Cumbria, but just the south part of the county, are in the process of consulting on a policy for sensory integration therapy, which is a very specific type of therapy. And I just wanted to name check this because this will have implications about what we can do with regards to meeting sensory processing needs. At the moment, the outcome is still to be confirmed, so I can't give you an update yet. But regardless of whatever that outcome of that policy is, and hopefully some of you have had the chance to review it and comment on it, we know that we need to better meet the needs of sensory processing of our children. So whatever happens with that policy, we will be saying how we are going to meet the sensory processing needs of children. But it's just helpful to keep in your mind that there is this other bit of work, this interdependent going on. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pass on to my lovely occupational therapy colleagues who we've been working with. Justine and Zena. So hopefully I have stopped sharing now, and I will invite them to introduce themselves and share.
I'm just going to share my screen now, so hopefully, if my technology works as it should do, you can see that. Can you see that?
Yeah. Yes.
Fantastic. So just so you know, when I'm in presenter view, I can't see anybody, so it is like I'm talking to nobody. But hopefully, if there is any technical issues, will you just let me know if you can't see or if the PowerPoint stopped working. So my name's Justine Lang, and I'm an occupational therapist, and I work in the Children's Learning Disabilities Service across Lancashire and South Cumbria for Lancashire Care South Cumbria Foundation Trust.
Hi, I'm Zena Cassells. I'm a children's occupational therapist working for North Cumbria Integrated Care Trust in the south of Cumbria. And Justine and I have been asked to come together to put this presentation together for you for this morning. So as Alison has said, please bear with us. It's the first time that we've done anything like this before. Obviously, we've run presentations before, but never for this many people. And it's been a real collaboration between the two trusts. So hopefully it'll be helpful and useful for you all. So just to run through the aims of the session. So the first part of the session is to just have an initial exploration of some of the terminology and language used in relation to sensory processing. There's a lot of language used, so I think sometimes it's useful just to kind of explore that a little bit. So we'll spend a little bit of time, not a huge amount of time, but a little bit of time exploring that language. And then we'll move on to the main part of the session, which is a presentation on hopefully helping you to understand how our senses affect behaviour and our ability to carry out day-to-day activities. This is going to be a very basic education session. The presentation that Justine does as part of her service is a 5-week workshop. And we could actually talk about this for a very long time. So we've had to really scale back the information that we're able to give in a quite a short space of time. So please bear with us. It is going to be, you know, kind of a very general presentation, but hopefully you'll be able to go away with some really good understanding and some strategies, some basic strategies of things that you can do to help. Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to move Zena out of the way that I can see. We thought we'd just sort of start off by looking at the terminology and the words that are being used. And I think some of you may already be familiar, some of you may not be familiar with sort of those wordings of sensory integration, sensory processing, and they're the terms that are maybe used in the most basic of terms. Both those terms refer to the processes in the brain, and that allows us to take signals from our senses. So that's signals from our 8 sensory systems, and they're just listed on that diagram in that image there. And then from that, we make sense of those signals and we have to respond appropriately to that. But people do seem to use lots of different terms, and you may hear terms and they seem to be being used interchangeably. So we really do need to be clear what we mean by the different terms, just to try and prevent any confusion. And like Zena's just said, we're not going to go into a lot of detail, but I suppose it's important to have that basic starting point for common language. And we've not really done any sort of work around terminologies across trusts and sort of agreeing terminologies, but just from our experiences and from our training, just being clear that sensory integration and sensory processing refer to the same processes. And the concept of sensory integration was first developed by somebody and described by somebody called Dr. Jean Ayres in the 1970s. And then in 2006, a Dr. Lucy Miller published a model of sensory processing disorder, and she based that model on Jean Ayres sensory integration. She's getting a little bit technical, but that's where the terminologies have come from. And therapists and authors tend to use a particular term depending on when they did their postgraduate training in sensory integration. Okay. So can you see the slide still? It's just stopped a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, fab. Okay.
So you just need to press enter. That's it.
Yeah, I just realised I had a blank screen. Sensory integration theory, like I've just mentioned, was developed by Dr. Jean Ayres in the late 60s and 70s. And she was an occupational therapist and a psychologist with an understanding in neuroscience, and she worked in the USA. And she defined sensory integration, well, I've just written it there really, the process by which people register, modulate and discriminate sensations received through the sensory systems to produce purposeful adaptive behaviours in response to the environment. Okay. And there is training for occupational therapists, speech and language therapists and physiotherapists, the Sensory Integration Network, and their definition is how we experience, interpret and react or ignore information coming from our senses. And sensory integration is important for all the things that we need to do on a daily basis, such as getting dressed, eating, moving around, socialising, learning and working. Okay. So we're going to post in the chat a link, because if you wanted more information around the terminologies and definitions, the Sensory Integration Network do have a page specifically that provides that information. So we'll pop that into the chat at some point. And I also just wanted to mention that they're holding a virtual conference on the 22nd of November. And if you go on their website, you might be able to access that conference as well. Okay. They seem to have a good lineup of keynote speakers. So moving on to sensory terminology, we've got Sensory integration and sensory processing, and those definition terms are used interchangeably. But we also need to be aware that we're not getting that confused with sensory integration therapy. Okay, so a therapist with postgraduate training in sensory integration may complete so for me, for example, an occupational therapy report, and I might use sensory integration theory to inform the assessment, and the results of that assessment may then inform a sensory diet or a sensory plan for that person. And when we're using the word sensory, we don't want to get that confused with sensory integration therapy. Some people will use that term, but generally in day-to-day use, the phrase sensory integration describes how our body uses our senses together. So that's what we sort of tend to need to remember when we're using that terminology. There's also, you might hear the words sensory processing disorder, and that's often used to describe sensory differences, and that goes back to Dr. Miller's sensory integration model. Okay. Currently, sensory integration dysfunction or sensory processing disorder is not recognised as a standalone diagnosis in any diagnostic manual, such as the DSM-5 or the ICD-10, but sensory differences are recognised as part of other conditions, and for example, autism or attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, so the ADHD profile. Okay. And some professionals might favour using terminology such as sensory difficulties or sensory differences. And for me, that's my preferred terms that I tend to use. So you probably will hear me use those terms during this presentation. And today we're going to be talking about our senses in a way that will hopefully be useful and for you to, in everyday sort of general understanding and support.
Okay, so we're going on to think about the terms sensory profile or checklists. Those are other terms that a lot of parents hear about. So they are sensory tools used to evaluate a child's sensory patterns. Now, there's lots of different tools available. Some of them are standardised and some of them aren't. But the real value in using those tools is the interpretation of them. So anybody can kind of do a checklist of a child's sensory needs, but it's the ability to be able to interpret what that is telling us and how that is impacting on the child and their ability to be able to do day-to-day activities. So the sensory profile is designed by Winnie Dunn, who is one of the key people involved in the SI network world, and that is a standardised assessment that somebody with that postgraduate experience should be completing alongside the families and the other carers of a child, and then it's the ability to be able to interpret that information, which is the really key important part of using that. There are other checklists widely available. If you go onto the internet, you can get all kinds of sensory checklists, and they're absolutely fine to use just to kind of give a bit of an indication of a screening tool of a child's sensory needs. But really, to gain the really useful information from that, you do need to have the experience to be able to interpret the results. So yes, and that can be anybody. There's lots of different professionals who can do that as long as they have the postgraduate experience and training in working with children with sensory processing needs. So those checklists and profiles would go on to contribute to a sensory assessment. So ideally, if we feel that a child needs that more detailed intervention, then a sensory assessment would be carried out, and that would include observations of the child and the use of the sensory tools available. But again, that really should be carried out by somebody with that postgraduate training with an experience of working with those children. And as Justine touched on earlier, sensory integration therapy is, oh, sorry, excuse the cat. I knew this would happen. So sensory integration therapy is an intervention that actually follows the Jean Eyre's theory, and uses play activities in ways to actually change how the brain reacts to sensory information. So it's more of an changing the underlying processes involved in our senses, rather than looking at the wider context. So sensory diet, sensory plan, sensory lifestyle, again, those are all terms that are widely used, and they all refer to the use of sensory strategies to support the child in their everyday life. So either by modifying their environment or providing activities or different ways for the child to be able to get the sensory input that they need throughout the day. So the term sensory diet is used quite a lot, and I think sometimes people expect there to be quite a rigid kind of layout of this. The child needs to do this at this time. I prefer to think of it more in a case when we're thinking about our food diet. We don't eat the same thing at the same time every day. We follow our dietary needs, we follow our body's needs as to what we eat and when, and it's exactly the same with our senses. It's our ability to be able to understand what sensory input our body needs to sustain us, and when and how they achieve that. So a sensory diet isn't a kind of a set diet, it's more of an understanding of a person's sensory needs, and what strategies help that individual person to be able to gain those needs. So part of the process is carrying out an assessment of a person's sensory needs. But again, that would need to be carried out by somebody with experience working with children and adults with sensory difficulties. And the sensory education is what we're hopefully going to be doing today, or beginning of it at least, is kind of providing that general understanding, that understanding of the senses, and how parents, carers, schools, adults, people who work with children with these difficulties, how they can be supported to identify their sensory needs and provide them with the strategies that they need throughout the day to support them to carry out everyday activities as best as they can. So in summary, I think it's really, really important to understand that we all process sensory information. So you and I, adults, everybody, we all process sensory information, and we all do it differently. We are all sensory beings, and our children are no different to us. So actually, when we're thinking about sensory processing, it's really important to also understand our own sensory needs as adults, and as people looking after and caring for these children. So just to, as a kind of a starting point, just have a think about your own likes and dislikes. You know, how our senses and our sensory environment impacts on ourselves and how we react to those. So thinking about, you know, what do you do to help you to concentrate, to keep alert, to calm or de-stress. So for example, you know, obviously we're not used to sitting down for as long as we are. So you might find yourself squirming in your seat. You might find yourself, you know, drinking from a water bottle. You know, some people doodle on a piece of paper. You know, we all do things to allow us to be able to maintain our focus and our concentration, and to help us to calm and de-stress when we're in situations that we're struggling with. And our children are no different. So, you know, it's part of a really big picture. So hopefully understanding how we process sensory information is the first step to understanding your child and how they can be supported. And so that's what we're going to go on and talk about.
Okay, so this is just a nice image, this iceberg analogy. Obviously, what you see on the outside, and then we've got lots of other things going on underneath. And when we're looking at a young person's sensory needs, sometimes I sort of describe it as it's a bit like being a detective, so you're trying to unpick things a little bit further. I sort of sometimes describe it as either having your sensory glasses on or your sensory goggles. We need to think that sensory is one element of lots of other things, and it should form part of the holistic view of a young person's needs. And obviously, as a parent, you will have some ideas around what your child is struggling with, and you know your child best. But as you can see from some of the list there on that visual, there might be different reasons why a young person may be responding the way they are, and sensory is listed on there, and that's just one element maybe of that jigsaw puzzle in a way of what's going on for that young person. Okay. So we're going to move straight on to quite a lot of information now. So we're just going to, yeah, there's going to be a lot to take in. So we're going to move on to the 8 senses, the 8 sensory systems. So they're listed there on that slide, and some of those might be familiar to you, but some might not be. You may not have heard of some of them. So for example, the vestibular system, which relates to movement and balance. There's the proprioceptive system, so that relates to sort of body awareness. That they're words that you might be familiar with, or you might not be. And also interoception as well, that 8th sensory system's listed on there. But you might be more familiar with the visual system, for example, auditory, which is hearing, olfactory, which is smell, gustatory, which is taste, and then tactile, which is touch. And like Zena just mentioned, sometimes it's really good to think about your own sensory systems to understand the systems, and then think about your child's, because we all experience sensory input differently. And as we move through the slides, we're going to play some videos for you that will explain the proprioceptive, vestibular and tactile systems if the technology works. And it's important to remember, I suppose, that some individuals may have difficulty processing input just in one particular sense, but other individuals may experience difficulty integrating inputs from more than one sensory system. And again, if you want more information around the different categories of sensory difficulties, because we're working to a time frame today and we can't cover everything, and we'll also put a link in the chat. So it's the link that provided the information about the different terminologies for sensory integration and sensory processing. If you click that link, it'll take you to a page, and you can scroll down and it'll go into different categories as well to give you a bit more information if you wanted to further your knowledge after this as well. So I'm going to start with the visual system first, and it's always important to rule out that there isn't any medical reason that somebody might be experiencing some difficulties in the visual system. So we want to make sure that there isn't a sensory impairment, so for example poor eyesight. So we would obviously go and see an optician first. When we're thinking about the visual system, breaking it down a little bit more, some people can experience over-responsivity to visual input, and some people can also experience sort of under-responsivity. So if you're over-responsive, you might see somebody, your child, or you might be able to relate to it yourself. You might avoid or dislike bright lights. Sunlight might cover the eyes or squint. You might get headaches, feel sick from continuous visual stimulation. So, for example, watching television, using a tablet, a computer, etc. If I think about my own sensory systems and my visual system, I can get a headache if I work in an office with bright lights and the glare from the laptop screen. I'm quite sensitive. So I can relate that to me, but by the end of the day, I've got that headache, I've got that sick kind of feeling. You know, and you might notice that your child might be not wanting to sit in direct sunlight. They might prefer darker, dim lighting in the environment. They might want to wear sunglasses all the time. You might pick up on these little clues that might indicate that. If somebody's under responsive, They might like to seek lots of visual input actually, so they might really enjoy looking at those light up toys or flickering lights, just anything that sort of gives that visually stimulating input. And then if we consider visual sensory discrimination or perception, we might think about what do we visually see? Do we see a P or a Q? We might struggle to estimate distances. We might miss objects in the path or trip and bump into things. I know from a visual perception point of view, if I'm trying to find something when I'm cooking at night in a drawer of all my knives and all my utensils, I really struggle to find some things, and it's right there in front of me. Okay. So some strategies to try if you're under responsive is just really you want to provide that increased visual input. So it can be optical illusions, fidget spinners, alter the environment with the lighting. You could use mirrors, for example. If you were over responsive, you would make those environmental alterations and consider the environment with low level lighting. You would reduce the clutter, just generally less stimulating environment for some people. If we're struggling with that perception, you know, like I mentioned before, I struggle to find things in drawers if it's a really busy drawer. Doing activities such as Where's Wally, word searches, they're all kind of strategies you can use to try and sort of support a development. But also we need to think about what your child, what the young person you look after likes doing and what they enjoy doing as well. And then also with the visual system, we need to think about movement, as vision guides our movement and it will impact upon how we move around the environment. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour of the visual system. So I'm going to move on to the auditory system now. So some of you might recognise some difficulties in the system for your children or the young people that you support. So if they're over responsive, they might dislike those loud sounds, they may cover their ears frequently, so they might create those natural ear defenders, putting their hands over their ears. Higher pitched sounds might be worse for some people, or they might react to background sounds that most people could efficiently filter out. So if we think about the environment that we're in, so when I think about my auditory system, if I'm in a busy office environment, got people on the phone, people talking, different things happening, I really struggle to focus because I can't really filter everything out as well as I should be able to. So we need to think about what it's like for people if they're in those busy environments. So school's quite a good example, in a classroom or a dining hall, out in the community, in the supermarkets, we might see people really struggle in those environments and respond to that auditory input. So they might have a sort of an emotional response, and that response might be bigger than you would expect to certain situations. For example, they might be really sensitive to hoovering, vacuuming, the blender going, or a dog barking. They might be bothered or distracted by small sounds. They might really pick up on sounds like a clock ticking, hearing the hum of the fridge, water dripping from a tap. Obviously, from relation to my own sensory systems, my husband's watch drives me generally mad because all I can hear is this tick, 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 tick. So for some young people, they can really struggle with that. And I can give an example of somebody I worked with a long time ago. I used to go into a mainstream school, and one of the TAs came to me and said, "Oh, I'm doing some reading with this young person, and he really just won't attend. I can't get him to go through the book." And then we had this conversation, and she went with this young person, and I went into the room that they were in, and straight away there was a fan there, and I could hear this fan going. So I went back to the TA and said, "Oh, try doing your one-to-one reading in a different environment." And she came back to me the week after and said, absolutely, could finish the whole book, and it was pure and simply because that fan was in the environment, and he was just so distracted by it. So really think about the environment when we're thinking about that auditory differences and sensitivities. We also need to think about the unpredictability of the sounds as well, because sometimes that might be the issue rather than being oversensitive. It might just be that sheer sort of immediate response to a sudden sound. So for example, like hand dryers, or going into to public toilets where they've got the automatic flushing toilet systems and things like that. If we're thinking about somebody who's under responsive, this person might always speak loudly, or they might prefer loud music or television, might make their own noises whenever they're in a quiet environment. They might create noise by tapping on an object or the table, humming, or they might crave common background noises. So for example, they may want a fan running all the time, or might like listening to sort of white noise on white noise apps and things like that. Might put their ears up to listening for sounds as well. So some practical strategies from an auditory perspective is that I gave you the example of going to public washrooms, didn't I, for the loud flushing toilets. You could put a post-it note over that automatic flushing system. It doesn't work, let them be in control of it to remove the post-it note when they've finished using the toilet. Hand dryers, can try and avoid that as much as possible, and we would maybe want to try and build up their tolerance of loud sounds if we're sensitive. Some people do use ear defenders, and ear defenders can really support some people. We do recommend not using them all the time, because actually ear defenders can make you more sensitive over time if you're constantly blocking out the sounds. So probably just use those at real difficult times when that person's really struggling with their environment and sounds. If somebody's under responsive, from a strategy point of view, you might then offer activities that provides lots of auditory input. So it can be musical instruments, microphones, songs, music, all those kind of activities. Songs that include shapes, colours, that might help solidify new learning concepts, sound books, but you would just basically give them that auditory input that they're looking for. Okay, going to move on to the sense of smell now, the olfactory system, and that's an alerting sense, so it alerts us to danger. So obviously, if we could smell a fire, chemicals, it's all that alerting sense to us, so it's a really useful sense. But I don't know if anybody's noticed that you can link past experiences to your sense of smell, because we actually go through a process where we emotionally tag certain situations, and that can be a negative experience or a positive experience. It just may evoke those memories. So for example, for me, if I smell parking, that takes me back to my childhood and my grandma baking parking. So I don't know if you can all have a little think about any smells that take you back to something, to a situation, but that can happen for quite a few people. So if we think about, if we've got somebody who's really struggling with their sense of smell, we also need to be aware that actually, are we evoking certain memories? From an environmental perspective, difficult environments tend to be maybe your kitchen, if they're really resistive to certain smells. The supermarket can be overwhelming with lots of different smells. In school, the gymnasium, the dining hall. And if somebody is sensitive to smells, they actually may have a physiological response. They might gag with certain smells, and those smells for everybody else might be mild, but for that person it's really, really quite strong. And they might avoid foods because of their smells. They might avoid public places because of many different smells. They might actually be a picky eater or have a limited diet and prefer bland foods because of the smell as well. Okay. If we've got somebody who really needs more sort of smells, they might frequently smell people and objects. They might enjoy those strong smells, and they might not notice those dangerous smells, for example, chemicals, gas, permanent markers, those kind of smells. They might crave certain smells. So when we're thinking about the sense of smell, we're thinking about how are they experiencing that smell? Are they discriminating the smell correctly? So can they identify a smell, or is the smell actually distorted? are they sensitive to smells or are they under responsive to smells? And it's closely linked to the gustatory system, our sense of taste. So sometimes you might see difficulties in both sensory systems. So from a practical strategy perspective, I can give you an example of somebody I worked with quite a few years ago. She was in high school and was really struggling to access school, very sensitive across all sensory systems, but smell was a really big one. So we did transitions into school at certain times when there was less people on the corridors because we were visually sensitive as well. And we used positive smells, so we explored smells with her to find out what she liked, what she disliked, and then we put a small, I think it was something citrus, on her collar. So sometimes, just from a practical perspective, she could mask quite discreetly when she was transitioning around school that certain smells, particularly walking past the gymnasium, that was a trigger for her. So moving on to the sense of taste, again, very quickly touching on this, there's so much information that you could give. It's an alerting sense again, and it warns us of danger, so maybe those gone off foods. And I don't know if you've actually sat down and maybe for lunch, sit down and think about what you're actually eating and how multi-sensory that experience of eating is, because we use the sense of taste, don't we, but we also have that oral tactile perspective as well of how things feel, as well as the sensation of taste. And then we've also got that oral motor ability as well, so being able to move food from the front to the back of the mouth, coordinating all these muscles, you know, whatever touches our lips, our tongue, our cheeks, we've all got to coordinate all that together. So it's one of probably the most difficult activities somebody can engage in is feeding. If you're over responsive with certain tastes that others might consider mild, so you might taste something and it might seem okay to you, but to somebody else it might actually be really strong. So they might avoid foods because of their smell and taste. They might be a picky eater, have a very limited diet, or prefer very bland foods. And for some people, we might actually see a really strong reaction. There might be some aggression around meal times, even if we are really, really sort of sensitive and find that whole environment very stressful. If we're under responsive, we might not be able to discriminate between the different tastes. So they might actually really enjoy strong tasting food. They might not notice those dangerous tastes, you know, for example, food that's gone off. They might be sensitive and considered picky eaters, but if they're under responsive, the food might not be registering, so they're seeking that strong tasting foods to try and increase that sensation. My daughter probably won't thank me for sharing with you, but when she was younger, so discrimination and taste was really difficult for her, and she really liked strong tasting foods, so she actually used to put mint sauce in her baked beans, and that's a really intense sensation, isn't it? But for her as well, it was a really alerting as well. It increased her arousal levels, and you can use food and the sense of taste for regulatory, to calm, and you can use it for alerting as well. Okay, so those citrus type foods, salt and vinegar crisps, would tend to be quite alerting for you. Something that's a little bit more chewy might be a little bit more regulating. Okay, if food's not registering as a practical strategy, so if that sense of taste, they're not really registering that sense of taste, sometimes using a straw to drink with or using a water sports capped bottle top can awaken your senses before you actually start eating. And we also need to consider the interoceptive part of that as well, and we're going to touch on that sensory system, and that is about sort of registering food and what we're eating and what we're drinking. Okay. When with the sense of taste, practical strategy wise, we don't want to put any pressure on a young person, and normally we would recommend trying what we would call a buffet of foods. And what we mean by that is putting food in separate dishes, and they can have that on the table, and they can use their visual system just to see and get used to it. They could explore it through touch, through their tactile system. And a good way to get person involved is through cooking and exploring through food, through touch, smell, sight, before they actually then start using their sense of taste. Okay. So that's a lot of information, and it was just looking at one slide, wasn't it really? But we're going to move on now to the vestibular system.
Okay, so the vestibular system is one of those systems that are the lesser known of the senses. So as Justine said at the beginning, we actually have 8 senses. So we have the 5 senses that Justine's just gone through that are the more well-known senses. But then we have vestibular and proprioception and interoception. So our vestibular system is all to do with movement. So we have our inner ear canals have fluid in them, and they're like our internal spirit level. It helps us to know how we're moving in space. The fluid in our inner ear canals move when we move, and then that sends messages to the brain using the nerve receptors in our inner ear canals to tell our brain how we're moving. So it helps us to know whether we're moving forwards and backwards, whether we're moving up and down, round and round in circles, whether we're moving smoothly or erratically. And it's a really, really important sensation for regulating our levels of alertness. And we'll explain levels of alertness as we go along. And obviously our vestibular system, our inner ear canals, they all react with gravity. So they link in with our sense of gravity, and that's how we know where we are in relation to the world and the environment around us. It's one of the first systems to develop in utero. So when baby is first conceived, it's one of the first sensations to develop, and it links in with our muscles. So we'll talk about our proprioceptive system in a minute, but our vestibular system and our proprioception system and our tactile system work very, very closely together to help us with that overall understanding of the world and how we interact with the world around us. So all of our senses develop as we grow. So we go through when we're first born, we go through a very, very, very rapid period of massive growth and development in all areas, and our senses are part of that. So all of our senses, as we get older, grow and develop and mature, and that's why as we get older and as we become adults, often our sensory systems are better able to cope with the environments that we find ourselves in than we do when we're very little. So I'll give you an example. So our vestibular system is all about kind of controlling our balance and our coordination and coordinating our body movements. So obviously, as we grow and develop, as we watch our toddlers move into preschoolers, move into school-age children, our body control and our coordination improves. And that's because all of our systems are improving and developing and working well together. Our vestibular system helps us to develop and maintain our normal muscle tone. So our muscle tone is what helps us to keep an upright posture and be able to alter our positions as we move through different activities. So our vestibular system is really, really important part of that. Our vestibular system links, as Justine touched on earlier, links with our visual system. It helps us to be able to know where we are and how we're moving without necessarily having to rely on our vision, as long as we've got that well integrated system working. So just to kind of give an example of that growth and development as we get older. So when I was younger, loved roundabouts. I would spend hours going round and round and round and round on roundabouts, because my vestibular system needed a lot of that movement input in order for it to develop and mature. But now I'm an adult, the idea of going on a roundabout just makes me feel ill. And we went to Alton Towers last week with my 2 teenage boys, and they were wanting to go on all the fast rides. And me and my husband went on about 2 or 3 of them. And then we were like, we can't do any more, because if I go on another fast moving ride that's stimulating my vestibular system, I think I'm going to be sick. So that's an example of, kind of an over-responsive system, because my nervous system is matured. If I get too much of that movement, it reacts, and my body can't cope. So often what you find for those younger children, again, touching on what Justine was saying about under-responsive and over-responsive, you might find some children who don't get enough of that movement sensation. And so they need to create opportunities to move in order to gain that extra movement. So going on the roundabouts, going on the swings, running around, climbing. But then you sometimes have some children who have an over-responsive system. So the movement can kind of tip them very easily the other way. And we'll kind of talk about that again as we go along. We do have a video. I think if we try and play the video and see if it works. I'm not in control of the video, so we'll see.
I will attempt it.
If it doesn't work, what we'll do is we'll post the link into the comments, and you can have a look at it. But this just kind of goes on to explain a little bit more about our vestibular system, probably better than I can.
Right, I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to just put my computer sound on, so hopefully you'll be able to hear the video if it plays like it should do. I'm hoping you can see that, and let me know if you can't hear it okay.
Talking about the vestibular system. It tells us how we are moving through sensors inside our ears.
There are 2 types of receptors. One is our semicircular canals that tell us about rotational head movement.
This helps us keep our balance, stabilize our eyes, and not feel anxious or overwhelmed when we are moving.
If this system is not working properly, we struggle with our balance, have difficulty with smooth eye movements, and struggle to use the 2 sides of our body together.
The second type of receptor is called the otoliths. They tell us about gravity so that we know which way is up and we feel secure on the earth.
They also tell us when we're speeding up and slowing down.
When the system is not working, we may feel fearful of movement or struggle to stay upright.
We can help this system by encouraging but not forcing special types of movement.
Slide,
Jump,
stop and start,
wobble,
swing. Let's move more.
For more information.
Okay, there we go. I will find the PowerPoint again. This is where it jumps about now, hang on. Okay.
Right. So as that video explained, our vestibular sensation tells a child when they're moving, and the direction of that movement helps develop their balance, posture, and their coordination. So gravitational security is what was described in that video is kind of the security of posture and being able to move away from the ground comfortably without feeling overly anxious, so that we don't feel like we're going to be falling over. And just some examples, if you're wanting to know kind of whether your child is kind of seeking movement or avoiding movement, just kind of spend some time watching your child and the types of activities that they're doing. Thinking about, kind of car, are they travel sick? Do they, when they go in a car, how do they react when they're in a car? Does going in a car and having that gentle rocking movement in the car calm them and soothe them? I know my oldest, the minute he was in the car, he'd be fast asleep, because he needed that movement. He needed that calming movement to help him. And even now, as an almost 16-year-old, he will sleep very easily in the car because that's what his vestibular system needs. He actually struggles to sleep at home in bed. He sleeps better when he's moving. I spent a lot of time rocking the pushchair when he was younger, to get him to go to sleep. But then on the other side, you might have some children who are travel sick, and that's because their vestibular system can't cope with the amount of movement sensation that it's receiving, and it's kind of reacting in a more extreme opposite reaction. So if we go on to the next slide and just have a little think about some of the activities that children can do to help their vestibular system. Again, like the video touched on, lots of jumping, hopping games, rocking chairs, hammocks, therapy balls, kind of on a therapy ball, with feet on the therapy ball and kind of rolling out and in with the hands. Gymnastics, riding a bike, any kind of activity that involves movement, but the key is to spend time with your child, understanding how they react to the movement and what movement works for your child, and understanding if there's any type of movement that they find more difficult, so that you can tailor the kinds of movement activities that they have. So when we're thinking about alerting activities, those are those kind of more erratic type movement activities, whereas the calming activities are the more slow, gentle, rhythmical rocking type activities. If you think back to when your babies are very small, you instinctively go into that gentle, rhythmical rock to calm them, because you instinctively know that is the calming type of movement that benefits your child. So if we go on to proprioception. So proprioception is all to do with our joints and muscles. So where we have nerve receptors in our inner ear canals for our vestibular system, for our proprioceptive system, we have nerve receptors in our joints and muscles. And it gives us that internal picture of ourselves. It helps us to know where we are in space, where we are in relation to objects, and the environment around us. It helps us to know how our limbs are moving and how we're coordinating. And obviously, just thinking back to the other senses, it links very, very closely with our vestibular system, our visual system, our tactile system. They all work together. So it allows us to control the kind of the rate and the time and the sequencing of movements. It allows us to control our muscle and muscle contractions and the force. So it helps us to be able to judge force. So, for example, I'm rubbish at throwing a ball. I cannot get a ball to somebody. It will, if I throw a ball to somebody, it will probably go sailing over their head. But I've got reasonable proprioception. So if I was to throw the ball again, I would be able to alter the force that I throw the ball, so that hopefully it would get a little bit closer to that person. And kind of when you're thinking about writing, pencil control. So you might come across some children who press really, really heavy or really, really light with their pencil when they're writing. It's our proprioception that allows us to regulate the force that we use when we're pressing down. And so we're able to recognize if we're pressing too heavy and then alter the force of our muscles so that we press lighter next time. So it's a really, really important sensation. So we all develop our proprioception, from the very minute we're born. The first thing we're encouraged to do is put our babies on their tummy. that tummy time is massively, massively important. It's so important. And if you think about babies' development, the first thing that they do is prop. They start to push up through their arms and move the top part of their bodies and their heads. And that propping and that use of their muscles at that very, very early stage really is the beginning of that development of their proprioceptive system, because the propping really helps to stimulate those joints and muscles. And then if you think about crawling, so children go from propping to sitting to crawling, and crawling is a hugely important part of a child's development. If you think about on their hands and knees, the amount of sensory stimulation, the amount of stimulation through their joints and muscles that they get when they're on hands and knees is huge, is really, really important. And then once they start crawling, they start exploring their environment. And it's that exploration of their environment on hands and knees that's really good for helping them to be able to understand and develop that understanding of where they are in relation to the objects around. So I remember my children kind of crawling underneath the dining table and bumping their heads on the chair. And that was them learning where they were in relation to the chair, and they didn't do it again because they built up that sense of where they were in relation, and that's the development of their proprioception that's allowing them to do that. So that crawling stage is actually really, really important. I was probably one of the only mums that was quite happy for my children not to get up and walk really, really early. I wanted them to be able to crawl for as long as they possibly could, and that's why a lot of the activities that we suggest when children are struggling with their proprioception are a lot of hands and knees, tummy time experiences. So I don't want people to worry if their children have missed out on those stages, because sometimes children do miss out on those stages, and there are a lot of children out there who don't crawl, who don't have a problem with proprioception. So that's nothing to worry about, but it's just to try and look at that link between the hands and knees and the crawling and that development of the proprioception and the exploration of their environment. Some children do find that crawling stage really quite difficult because of the hypermobility and the flexibility of their joints. So some children, some adults, people are naturally bendy. All children are bendy when they're first born, but as we grow and develop, the muscles strengthen and the joints strengthen and become more stable. And the ligaments are more stable. So hypermobility is to do with ligaments. So we have ligaments that hold our joints together. There are like elastic bands that are stretchy. So they need to be stretchy in order for us to be able to move our limbs. But if they're too stretchy, then we don't have that kind of stability that we need to be able to hold our joints together. So as I said, as we start moving around and grow and develop, our muscles and our ligaments tighten up and increase in stability. But if you don't have a lot of stability at your joints, then that can make forming those hands and knees positions quite difficult. And so some children can struggle with that crawling and other activities as they get older. But the other thing that hypermobility, joint laxity can cause is that if you think about the proprioceptive receptors are within your joints, if the joints aren't as stable as they could be, then the nerve receptors may not be picking up the messages quite as accurately as they could be. So we do sometimes see some children who are bendy who have poor proprioception. The last thing to kind of touch on before we move on to the video on proprioception is the element of regulation that proprioception provides. So proprioception is a really, really good sensation for calming and regulating the nervous system. So a lot of us, I'm not going to say all of us because some people don't like hugs and massages, but a lot of us do like those big, tight, squeezy hugs and massages. And you know, kind of big nice stretches. And when you stretch your arms you get that nice feeling in your shoulders and your elbows, and that's proprioception, and that's very calming and regulating for the nervous system. And we often find that you can bring proprioception activities into a child's kind of toolkit of strategies to help to counterbalance other sensations that they might be finding difficult. And so really the thing to think about is any activity that's involving joints and muscles will be providing proprioception. So again, when we're thinking about looking at the activities that your child enjoys or finds difficult, just have that idea of joints and muscles in your head while you're considering that. Should we have another go at the video and see if this one works?
Okay. Let's go. Stop sharing. It seems like a long way around, but I'll share again. Put my sound on. Hopefully find the right video. It's not that one, is it? Hopefully you can see and hear this okay.
Sensory mini-series. Today we are talking about proprioception. This is the sensation we get through our muscles and tendons. These are the proprioceptors in the muscles and in the tendons. They respond to
Oh, sorry, Justine. I think your sound's just muted.
helping us to stay regulated and pay attention.
Sorry, I must have knocked it on my headset.
At the level of the parietal lobe, we get a conscious moving picture of our body from inside our muscles. This helps us know where our body is. It also helps us to plan how we can use our body to interact with the world around us with smooth and graded movements. Without good feedback from this system, we can have difficulty staying calm and focused. We pull out a drawer too hard, not grip something hard enough, or struggle to have our bodies in the right place at the right time. We work this system by increasing feedback through the receptors. So push, pull, lift, carry, climb, jump, and stretch. Let's move more.
Okay. Sorry about that if you missed a little bit of it from me muting it. The videos will be posted, the links in the chat, so if there was something that you wanted to watch again, you'll be able to access them that way as well. Okay, let me find the PowerPoint again. I think I've gone past it.
Thank you, Justine. So as the video just kind of touched on, your proprioception system is stimulated when they experience pressure, pushing, pulling, lifting, carrying. So it's often referred to as heavy muscle work. That's quite a nice term, I think, because it really does kind of describe the activities and the actions involved with the proprioceptive activities. So what we often find is that because it regulates the nervous system and it helps to work on that levels of alertness and ability to focus and regulate the system, it can be really, really beneficial to do some proprioception activities before periods of focus and concentration. So when we're thinking about children in school, you can do some really, really simple activities like, so chair press ups is a really nice one that a child can do without anybody else knowing. So just put your hands underneath your kind of bottom, the top of your thigh, So your palms are down on the seat of the chair, and then you kind of press up so that you're lifting your bottom up from the chair, and you get lots of really nice proprioception through the arms, and a child can do that in the classroom without anybody else knowing. You can do things like wall press ups, so hands on the wall and kind of pressing into the wall. Table press ups, the same, pressing down on the table. You can put your hands together in a kind of a prayer position and kind of squeeze your hands together. You can use things like Play-Doh, blue tack, stress balls, squeezy balls. All of those kinds of things are really good for stimulating those joints and muscles. And you can do, if you can get that really intense kind of proprioceptive input just before you're doing some a kind of focused, concentrated lesson, or if you're wanting to sit down to a meal time or something, that's when we're talking about a sensory lifestyle, a sensory plan. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. It's thinking about, right, well, we can do that activity before we do this activity, because that activity will help to improve the focus and concentration for this, for dinner time, or for this particular lesson. So if you're not sure whether your child is struggling with proprioception, what some of the things that we often see, some of the signs that we often see, children, the heavy-footed. So when they're walking, because they can't judge the force of how they're putting their feet on the ground, so they can often walk quite heavily footed. Poor body awareness, poor spatial awareness. So kind of bumping into objects and children. We often hear the phrase tripping over fresh air, so tripping over their own feet. Sometimes find that some children rely more heavily on their vision because their proprioceptive sense isn't working quite as well. So when they're going up and down steps and stairs, they will often look down at their feet and use their vision to tell them where their feet are, rather than the proprioception sensation. And their kind of pressure regulation and regulation of the force of their muscles that we touched on. So the next slide just gives some a couple of activities, ideas, but again, so we can give you ideas of activities involving joints and muscles, but your child is probably already doing them. It's any activity involving joints and muscles. So again, just kind of have a little think about the activities that your child already enjoys and is already motivated and drawn to doing, and consider whether those activities could be something that you could use in other ways, in other situations, to help regulate their sensory system. So a couple of activities: carrying shopping, hoovering, power washing, animal walks, so kind of bear walks, crab walks, kind of pulling and pushing, supermarket trolleys, push chairs, carrying and lifting objects, climbing frames, and playgrounds are great places to get lots and lots of proprioceptive input. So if you're not sure, take them to a playground and just let them play in the playground, because they can get lots of proprioceptive input through climbing frames, monkey bars, those kinds of things. We've got one parent that we've worked with, and the mum recognised that her little girl really needed that proprioception through climbing. And so they had a room in their house, and they just kind of put loads of climbing things, so you can get things that can attach to the door frames that children can, like the monkey bars and the parallel bars that they can hang from. You can get and she kind of put all of these things all over this playroom, and it was exactly what she needed, and it really helped her. So we're going to move on to the tactile system, and Justine's going to talk about this one.
Okay. So the tactile system refers to that sense of touch, and skin is the largest organ, and it's got numerous receptors that detect that light touch, pressure, temperature, pain, vibration. And there are two pathways to our sense of touch, and they serve different purposes. So one's a protective pathway, one's a discriminative pathway. Okay, and that touch sense is detected through the receptors in our skin, and then that provides us with information to allow us to feel where we're being touched and the quality of the touch. And obviously it allows anybody to determine where they're being touched without using vision as well, okay, if your sense of touch is working accurately. So different parts of the body have different amounts of receptors. So for example, your back and the back of your legs, your calves have less than the face and feet, for example. So my daughter was very sensitive when younger with her feet in particular. Could not tolerate socks. Shoes had to be on very tight. She would pull the straps off shoes. We'd go through 3-4 pairs of shoes a month. My children is how I got interested in sensory integration, because I've got 2 children on very different ends of the scale. But if you think about your feet have a lot of receptors in there, and also think about your hands, and you need to get additional information, don't you, when you're walking, from your feet and from your sense of touch from your hands as well. So the sense of touch is really important to us. And like I mentioned, it has that protective role. So if something touches us, automatically that protective pathway, it's just like an automatic alerting sense. We know it's there immediately. And also we use the sense of touch, don't we, to comfort for sometimes. So if you think of a crying baby, the first thing you might do is pick the baby up, and through the sense of touch you might just think you're going to calm that baby down. Obviously if they've got a sensitive sense of touch, then maybe you might not do, but generally that's what you would automatically do. You would want to comfort that crying baby. And if you also think from a sense of touch perspective, feeding, sucking, that all provides sense of touch, and it can also be very regulating as well. So the sense of touch can be, for some people, very regulating. For others it can be very alerting. Okay. And as we develop and grow, and as our sensory systems develop, we connect through sense of touch. So as adults, we like to give hugs, we like to feel close. And we use the sense of touch through everyday interactions, and it's how we learn about the world around us. So I'm going to give you an example that hopefully will help explain the differences between the protective and the discriminative pathways. So if we walked into a spider's cobweb, immediately, like instantly, our protective system, if it's working, will kick in. So our arousal levels will increase, and we'll be like, oh my, what's that? And it's like an automatic check-in that we're safe system. So there's no conscious thought to that about that process. It's an immediate response. And obviously whatever we deem as a risk to us, we'll get out of the way immediately. So what happens after that initial reaction, we might then touch where we felt the spider's web. And so, for example, if it was on my face, I'd then, through the sense of touch, explore the area to remove that cobweb that's stuck in my hair or on my skin. So then I'm using my discriminative touch, because it's providing me with more accurate information to find that cobweb, to remove it. So we have two ways there, don't we? Protective and discriminative purposes. And for some people, our protective system might kick in when it doesn't need to kick in, and we might then have that sort of immediate sort of dislike to the sense of touch. But as a rule of thumb, through our sense of touch, we have a protective sort of initial response to touch, and then we have that discriminative where it provides us with more accurate information so we can understand what we're experiencing through touch. I do have a video to play, so I just need to work out how to come out of here again, and I will put my sound on, hopefully not hit mute this time. Go on to here. Oh, I need to get rid of this somehow.
For more information, talk to your local optician.
Is this the sense of touch?
This is the sensory mini-series. Today we are talking about the touch or tactile system. It tells us about the feelings of our skin inside and outside our body. The touch system helps us to develop safe and secure relationships through cuddles, hugs and strokes. It warns us of danger, like when something is too hot to touch. It helps us to develop refined movement, particularly in our mouths and in our hands for work and play. When this system is not working, we can get bothered by certain touch on our skin, for example, when we're washing or wearing clothes. Or we can miss important information that keeps us safe or helps us to learn. Without good touch information, it's hard to develop complex movement skills like facial expression and handwriting. We can get our hands ready for organising and understanding touch information with exercises like wheelbarrow walking. Chewing gum or crunching ice can help us to prepare our mouths for interpreting touch, for example, before we eat a meal. By using different materials like sand, paint or foam, we can be introduced to new sensations in a safe and playful way. For children who struggle to identify touch accurately, we can play games to help them recognise texture, shape, size and edges. This helps them to understand what objects are and how to use them. Thank you for watching. For more information.
Okay. I really like those little mini series, those videos. I think they really help provide that information in a really sort of succinct way. I'll just find my point again. Hopefully you can. It doesn't want to load. I've got the blue circle of doom. Just hang on a minute. I knew it was too good to be true. Well, I'm hoping that you can see that now. Fab. Okay. So it's really nice, that video, to explain like we need our sense of touch, don't we, to be able to engage in everyday activities. So functional tasks like getting dressed, that discriminative touch for us to be able to do our zips, our buttons. We use the sense of touch for when we're writing with our handwriting and to be able to manipulate small tools, so cutlery, for example. And we definitely learn through our sense of touch of our immediate environment as well. We explore objects, don't we, to find out more about them. Okay. So if we were thinking about sensory strategies when we're exploring that sense of touch, we also need to think about what are we trying to do. Are we looking at somebody's sense of touch, that tactile system, because perhaps they're resistive to touch and maybe they dislike the sense of touch? So maybe if that's the case, we would use a graded approach through our sense of touch to get them to be able to tolerate sensations a little bit more. So we might start off doing that by exploring tactile media, so different materials that are dry. So for example, like your pasta, your rice, those kind of things. And once we can tolerate that, we could then make it a little bit tackier. For example, icing sugar, you could wet that a little bit and make it a bit tackier. Shaving foam, once they feel safe and secure in exploring, we would never force something on a child. It has to be through that playful engagement and motivational, but we would do it in a graded way if we're quite resistive to exploring different sensations. If it's something like difficulty or struggling with grooming, for example, like hairbrushing, maybe we could Get the body prepared for that touch before we do the hair brushing. So we could do some deep massage to the scalp, get ready to touch, prepare, you know, that the person could be sat down so they're feeling safe, secure, grounded, and they could use a mirror so they can see what's happening. They could hold the brush and do it themselves, so they're in control of that touch. Okay. So if we've got difficulties with our sense of touch, it can impact upon us in lots of different ways in terms of those grooming activities, or in terms of just engaging in everyday activities. We've got some different activities there that use lots of different sensations. So baking, gardening is a great one, and that also gives you a lot of sort of that heavy muscle work as well. Water play, sand play, mud kitchens, that's all about exploration through our sense of touch. And when we're thinking about the strategies that we're using, it is important to think about why am I doing this? But if you do it in a graded way and introduce those activities, you can start to explore the different sensations. And we've got down there different temperatures, different weights, that's all through our sense of touch. Okay. With our sense of touch, you might sometimes, if they're really sensitive, see an extreme emotional response and it might not fit the situation. So going back to my daughter, when very younger with the shoes, were very controlling and rigid with routines because we couldn't tolerate that sensation on our feet. Where we would have to wear Crocs, we'd have to walk a certain pathway, we'd have to sit on a certain bench, we'd have to prepare the feet before we put the shoes on before school. So sometimes if you know that you've got a child in a situation that's struggling, using, that Zena mentioned about using proprioceptive activities that can support with regulation. Now I know what I know, and with hindsight, I could have, with my daughter, done some proprioceptive activities before that school run, just to sort of try and help support with those arousal levels and that elevated level of arousal that she was experiencing. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the interoceptive system now. So this is a really big topic, interoception at the moment. So we're only going to give you a really small amount of information. And some of you might know about the interoceptive system already, some of you may not. But basically what that system does, it lets you know what's going on inside your own body. So it allows us to experience those body sensations such as a rumbling tummy, that racing heart, that dry mouth, those tense muscles. And it helps us to manage how we feel by prompting us to take action based on the body signals we notice. And we might have some people who are actually really internally very aware of their body signals. So for example, going to sleep, actually their heart beating is really, really intense for them, and that can bring on anxiety in itself, that sensation. But you may have children who have that poor interoceptive ability, so they may not know when they're hungry or full, they may not know when they're hot or cold, thirsty, when they need the toilet, recognise pain. So basically, interoception provides us with that perception and interpretation of those signals from our internal organs. So it gives us that physical state, okay, that fatigue, that nausea, that hunger, that thirst, need to urinate, defecate, internal pain, discomfort, internal heart rates, internal temperatures, and then we might experience those emotions. So then from that we understand that we get those emotions, don't we, and anger, excitement, frustration, anxiety, sort of fear, love, sadness, trust. We feel those sensations, and that provides us information about our body state and emotion, and then we have an urge to act based on that. Okay. If someone's having difficulty with interoceptive awareness, they might see difficulties, sort of, for example, trying to get to sleep, so like irregular sleep patterns. They might feel sick all the time, or they may not present with any sign of sickness. They might drink all the time, or they might only drink when prompted. There's lots of different ways of how we experience our internal sensations. They might not notice or that they're tired, or they might appear that they're easily tired from that physical exertion, and they're not noticing if they're feeling hot or cold. What you normally see with interoceptive difficulties, so if we, from an emotional point of view, if we can't feel or understand what's going on internally from our body sensations, we then might not realise that we're actually starting to become feeling anxious, sort of getting really quite stress, elevated levels of arousal, and that's then we see those young people who might go from 0 to 100 really quickly because they're not capturing that middle bit of that understanding what their body's feeling like and what they need to do to regulate themselves. It is a massive subject, the interoceptive system. And for these people, they might switch between those various emotions quite quickly. And they might also struggle with those questions like, you know, what does this feel like? How do you feel about? So because of time, really, if you would like to know more about this system, there is an occupational therapist called Kelly Marler, and she sort of knows an awful lot about this system, does a lot of training in it. She has her own book out, The Interoceptive, the 8th Sensory System, and it's actually got some really nice little practical strategies in there. So we will be putting in the chat a link to that website as well, because there is some quite nice information on there and some free resources and things. Okay. So moving on to this slide, just to summarise really, because we've talked about the 8 sensory systems and we've just given you that brief introduction of that sensory awareness of what the sensory systems do. And what we need to think about when we're thinking about our bodies when we're thinking about our bodies and we're thinking about that sensory integration, how our bodies process all that sensory information, we're a bit like a computer. So I'm not saying your child's like a computer or we're like a computer. So if I'm referring to myself and my central nervous system, it's a bit like a computer in that what my central nervous system takes in is from what I see, what I hear, what I touch, what I taste, what I smell. I have to integrate all that. I have to make sense of it. And then from me making sense of it, I then can have a planned response. So that integration of that input means that I am able to attend, I'm able to interact with others, I can interact with the environment, it will mean I've got, you know, good self-esteem, self-control, I can express my feelings. If I'm not integrating all that information correctly, or it's struggling to process it efficiently together, then we might see an emotional response to that, or we might see some differences, okay? And that's then we have that sort of automatic response, okay? So really, to summarise, what we're trying to say is when we're thinking about sensory integration, it is complex, and our bodies are complex, aren't they? And it is about how we take in that information, how our brain, how our body, our central nervous system interprets it all together, okay? And if it's working correctly, we can do all those things that are listed there. If not, it may then have an impact upon our everyday engagement.
So, so this slide just describes the kind of the developmental sequence of how our sensory motor skills develop. So, right at the very bottom of the screen of the pyramid is our sensory systems. So that really does kind of highlight how our sensory systems are the building blocks for all of our other skills, all of our sensory motor skills. And so our sensory systems kind of develop. And then as they develop, we begin to be able to organise ourselves, our body awareness, ability to be able to screen out that unwanted sensory information that Justine touched on. And then we're then able to develop those more refined, complex, higher level skills. So eye-hand coordination, attention, language, gross motor skills. So it's that interpretation, it's that amalgamation of all of the senses all together that allow us to start to develop those more complex motor skills. And then once those are developed, then we can start to think about our academic skills, daily living skills, and our behaviour. And it doesn't mean to say that we can't learn and develop those academic skills, daily living skills and behaviour, whilst we're at that very basic level of sensory development. But it's all to do with how we approach and support our children to be able to learn those academic skills, daily living skills and behaviour. Obviously, if you think about the length of time it takes for our sensory systems to grow and mature and develop, our children are learning and growing and mastering new skills all the time, even before their sensory systems are mature, are further on in their level of maturity. But it's how they are supported with that learning and development. And that's why our early years curriculum, our preschools, kind of reception all the way up to kind of that age, are very multi-sensory approach to learning and developing new skills and activities. The difficulty we have is that once we move out of that early years curriculum into the more kind of key stage 1 and certainly into key stage 2, we move away from the multi-sensory approach to supporting learning and development, because a lot of children don't need to have that approach, because for a lot of children their sensory systems have developed and matured to the point where they can cope with sitting in a classroom and the more structured curriculum. However, there are always going to be some children who are still at that lower level of development of their sensory systems and may have an ongoing difficulty with their sensory systems, which means that there needs to be consideration of how they can be supported with their academic learning and the learning of new skills and the regulation of their emotions and their behaviours. And so that's where it's really important to kind of share these ideas and educate schools, early years providers, so that that there is that awareness of the fact that just because a child is in key stage 2, there might be a reason why they're struggling to sit and cope in a classroom environment, and it might be because of where their sensory system development is. So it's all about recognising the level of development and supporting their learning at that appropriate level. I think the other thing that I like to use this pyramid as an analogy for we have that upwards direction, so our kind of how our skills develop, but there's also a downward direction in the sense that for all of us, if we're challenged, even as adults, even now, if we're challenged, then we revert back down to our sensory systems to help us, to support us. So I'm going to hold my hands up and say that I was worried about doing this. Kind of my stress levels were quite high, knowing how many people we were presenting to. So my sensory systems were on overload this morning, because I was reverting back down to my sensory systems, my sensory motor strategies, to help me to cope, because I knew I was going to be in a very, very stressful situation. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that we all process sensory information, ourselves, our children, everybody around us, our whole family. But it's recognizing that our children are doing exactly the same thing as us, but what you might be seeing is more intensive strategies. So whereas we might have subtle sensory motor strategies, so you didn't notice that I was twirling in my chair and kind of doing my sensory strategies, because my sensory system has matured. So actually the intensity of that sensory input that I need, I don't need that great intense strategy to help me to cope. I just need that more subtle. Whereas our children, because their systems are still developing, they still need to have that highly intensive input. So when they are relying on a sensory strategy, it's a little bit, it's more obvious generally, and more in your face, and sometimes not socially appropriate, because they haven't had those opportunities to learn what is appropriate to do in what environment and what situation. So really it's all about thinking about what is my child doing and is it helping them? And if it's helping them, can I continue to allow them to do what they're doing? Because if it's helping them, it's a strategy. It's whether or not that strategy is appropriate and safe. So if it's appropriate and it's safe, then that's absolutely fine. So I'll give you an example of, I did some training in school, and we were talking about a child who wouldn't sit down. They wanted to stand up to do all their lessons. And I said, well, why do they have to sit down? Because actually, when you're standing up, you get a lot more movement sensation when you're standing up than you do when you're sitting down. And actually, that child found standing up met all of his sensory needs. And actually, it wasn't impacting on anybody else. It was safe. And it was actually achieving what he needed to achieve. So the teachers went, oh, right. Well, in that case, we'll get him a high desk and he can stand up to all his lessons. And that's what they did. And he did really, really well. So it's just thinking about the behaviour that you're seeing, the actions that you're seeing, whether they are benefiting the child, and actually do they need to change. And in some ways, thinking about the fact that your children are no different to us as adults. I think the other thing is often that sometimes we see sensory motor strategies as a reaction to stress and difficult situations. So what you might be seeing is not necessarily a sensory processing difficulty, but what you might be seeing is a sensory reaction to help a child to be able to cope in a situation. And so the key is, again, watching your child, spending time with them. We use the term putting on sensory glasses. So thinking about the activity in terms of the senses that are being used and whether that activity is helping your child or not. And is it a strategy that's helping them to be able to do something, carry out an activity? I'm just aware of the fact that we only have 20 minutes left. We were going to try and have a short break, but I think we're running out of time. So I think if people are okay, we'll just kind of crack on, if that's all right, because we're moving into, we've got the next couple of slides are really starting to think about day-to-day activities and kind of thinking a little bit more about some more strategies that you can use to support your child. So we'll go on to the next slide to talk about levels of alertness. So our brain regulates how awake or sleepy we feel. And our brain uses our senses to be able to do that. So, for example, first thing in the morning when we wake up, most of us anyway, are really, really sleepy. So right at the bottom of that graph is the kind of the blue sleepy egg. So that's certainly me in the morning. I am a very, very sleepy person first thing in the morning. I'm very, very under aroused first thing in the morning, and it takes a lot of sensory information to get me going and get me moving in the morning. I'm a very visual person, so I need to watch telly. I don't care about the noise, so it can have the sound off for all I care. I don't care. I just need that visual input. And if the internet, the signal was playing up this morning on the telly, and I really struggled because I couldn't watch the telly this morning, which didn't really help with my stress levels. But that's me. That's my sensory setting. I need that visual input. And I very quickly realised that my oldest son was exactly the same. And the idea of getting him out when he was very little to nursery without allowing him just that short, kind of 10-15 minutes on the watching CBeebies, that's all he needed to get him to that level of alertness, that green, just right level of alertness that helped him to be able to do what he needed to do to get himself out of the house. And I think, again, when we're thinking about us as adults, as parents, as carers, I think it's really important to consider our level of alertness and our ability to be able to manage and cope and support our children. If our level of alertness is not at that just right level, because it's so much harder to support our children if our children are at an under aroused level or an over aroused level if we're not at that just right level. So that's really, really useful to really get to know your own levels of alertness and what helps you to maintain that green just right level. So the next level up is the kind of the yellow, excited, silly level of alertness, and I think it's really important to understand that it's absolutely fine to have this kind of yellow giddy level of alertness. We all need to be able to kind of let off steam, let off energy. Children need to run around the playground and be excited and silly, and that's absolutely fine. That's what we need to do in order to sustain our sensory systems. But it's really important to consider how much control we have. So when we're thinking about that yellow kind of excited higher level of arousal, as long as we're in control of that and we can bring ourselves back down to the just right green level, then that's manageable and that's okay. The difficulty is when we tip over into that yellow, into that red overload. So that FFF is fight, flight or fright. So that's your fight or flight, your survival. You know, there's all kinds of different terms around talking about our kind of meltdown, overly stimulated, overload, all of those kinds of descriptions. But they're basically talking about when our sensory systems are not able to control the amount of sensory information or other information that it's receiving, and then we kind of lose control of our ability to be able to regulate that, regulate our emotions, regulate our behavior. And that, again, that's where our sensory strategies can come in. So if we can try and again be detectives for our children and kind of have those, observe those behaviors, watch your child, work out what is it that what are the signs that your child is moving out of the yellow and into the red, and seeing if there's any of those strategies that might have worked in different situations that you might think, oh, do you know what, if that worked then, I'll bring that in and see if we can use that now and see if that will prevent or reduce the meltdown, the overload, kind of going into that red. It's not always going to work, and there are children who will go from blue or red or green straight into the red and completely bypass the yellow bit. But I think it's just really important, you know, if you can do it once or twice, then that really helps. I'll give you a really quick example of a family that I worked with, and we did this. We kind of went through this conversation with the mum. She went away, came back to the next session, and she said, you know what? We have a family gathering every weekend. We go to grandparents' house every weekend, and every weekend my daughter has a complete and utter meltdown. Really can't cope. And every weekend she asks to go to the cupboard under the stairs, and she says it's not Harry Potter, but she just there's a cupboard under the stairs that's really dark and quiet, you know, really reduced low arousal environment. And I've always gone, no, you can't. You know, we're here to see your grandparents. You need to stay in the room. You need to be sociable. You need to, be the good grandchild. And I've never let her go to this cupboard under the stairs. But after this conversation, she let her daughter go and spend just 5 minutes in this space that was very low arousal, and it just allowed her. She was able to recognise that she was in that yellow. And she knew what she needed to do, this little girl, to stop her from going in the red. She just needed to be allowed to do it. And the mum said, you know what? She spent a couple of minutes in the cupboard under the stairs. She came out and she stayed in the room for the rest of the afternoon, and we didn't have a meltdown. So it's just all about just maybe taking a step back and watching, watching your child and how they react and what sensations that they're reacting to. And they've probably already developed a lot of their own strategies. We just need to recognise that. So if we just go on to the next slide again, just kind of explores this a little bit more. Thinking about energy levels of alertness. There's lots of different terms that we can use. You can start to incorporate these terms into conversations with your child. And Justine's going to talk about sensory ladders in a minute, which is a really good way of incorporating the terms according to your child's motivations, your child's interests, whatever it is that they respond and motivate to. But it's a really good activity, maybe to kind of sit down with your child, to be able to help them to start to understand kind of the signs when they're at their different levels of energy, and understand what strategies, what activities help them to be able to regulate that. We use the term kind of co-regulation. So what we're hoping to aim for with our children and is for them to be able to regulate themselves. So we as adults are able to regulate our own sensory system and our own levels of alertness, but our children are too young to be able to do that. So what we need to do is work with them. So we need to guide and support our children so that as they get older, they are then able to understand their own sensory systems and what their own sensory needs are, and what helps them to be able to regulate their own individual sensory system. And I think the next slide is the fight or flight. So if we just expand a little bit more on that kind of red meltdown overload state that our children will often get into, it links into our fight or flight survival responses. So if our body's in an elevated state of arousal, it impacts on all of our kind of bodily functions. So that's when we feel threatened, our brain's primary role is to keep us safe. And so when we were talking earlier about how our brain takes on board all of these messages from the world around us through our senses, that information enters our brain at the top of the brainstem, and we have a very immediate reaction in those kind of high danger situations, because that is what keeps us safe. You know, if we put our hand in a flame, we don't want to have to engage the thinking part of our brain for us to, you know, send a message to our hand to move our hand away. We need to have an immediate reaction, otherwise we're going to get burnt. So all of our sensory information goes into that kind of reactive, instinctive part of the brain, and that is our fight or flight, our survival response part of our brain. And what happens is our body releases chemicals which allows our body to react very, very quickly. The difficulty we have is that if we are in a high intense, high stress situation for a long period of time, our body has these chemicals moving around our body, all the time, and we're always at this high state of arousal, high level of arousal, and we never really get the chance to kind of come down from that. So if your sensory system is over responsive and you're not able to filter out touch, taste, smell, or if you very easily get too much movement, then you can be very easily in this high state of arousal, fight or flight state for a lot of the time throughout the day, and we can that can have a kind of a big impact on our body, and our ability of physical feelings and our physical reactions. And what we often find is that some children will be in this state throughout the day at school, but because they are they are aware, socially aware, and they're aware of kind of the fact that they're not at home and in their kind of comfortable environment, they will often keep going and hide and hold it all together. And then when they come home, it's the Coke bottle effect. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Coke bottle effect. So the Coke bottle will be shaken and shaken and shaken all the way through the day. And then when they get home to their comfortable environment, then you take the top of the Coke bottle and it all comes out. So I think Justine's going to explore this a little bit more on the next slide.
Yeah, I really like this analogy of your stress bucket. It's a really nice visual just to explain. So if you think about yourself and your emotional stress bucket, We have our everyday stresses, don't we? And then on top of everything that we experience every day that we can tolerate, we might experience some new stresses. And then on top of that, we might experience some hunger, we might have poor sleep. And then we've also, on top of all that, within our emotional stress bucket, we might have to tolerate lots of sensory input that might be quite difficult for us. So if you're thinking about, like, for example, my emotional stress bucket, with my everyday stresses, I may be late to work because getting one of my children to school is very difficult, and then I might get stuck behind a tractor, so that makes me late into work. So then I've missed an early morning call that I should have made, and my emails, I've got to check up on all my emails, that I've forgotten my lunch. And then by the time I get to the evening when I've come home, somebody's not emptied the dishwasher and I have an absolute meltdown over somebody not emptying the dishwasher. Now, it's not the end of the world. It really doesn't matter. But at that moment in time, it's everything to me, because my little everyday stresses has built up and built up and built up until my stress bucket has overflowed. Okay, so if you think about children, and I can give you an example of a young man that I worked with a few years ago with a learning disability and autism, but he really articulated everything about his emotional stress bucket really well. So when he was getting up in the morning, if he was running ever so slightly late, he would become really quite stressed about that. He was also already worrying about what clothes he was going to have to put on because he didn't like the feeling of some of his clothes. He was also beginning to stress about the day ahead, all the people on the bus and the sounds, was people going to be loud on the bus. He was already worrying when he got into school about potential staff changes, any changes in that school routine. Then he was thinking about his lunch, and is it going to be something that I don't like? So by the afternoon, he would have a meltdown. And we had staff saying, oh, well, there was no trigger, there was nothing for us to see that, what the reason for that was. But then if we actually peeled back his day right back to the start of the day, and we looked at everything and really explained really lovely what he was experiencing, his sensory stress bucket, his emotional stress bucket had overflowed in the afternoon. So when we think about that stress bucket, what we want to do is put little holes in that bucket. And we can do that by using regulatory sensory strategies. And if we use those at regular intervals throughout the day, hopefully we can stop that bucket from overflowing. And sometimes what I find works really well with this stress bucket analogy is writing a list of what's calming. If you're doing it for yourself, do it for yourself. If you do it for your child, do it for your child. But what's calming? So what's going to put little holes in that bucket? What works well to bring them down? But also what's alerting, what brings them up as well to keep them attending and engaging. And it's about that fine balance, isn't it? But sometimes I think actually writing it down in a list of what works for sort of down regulation and up regulation can really help you then think about strategies that you're going to use to put little holes in your stress bucket. Okay. So when we're thinking about how can you support your child, we can do this by developing, and Zena's touched on this already, sort of the terminology and the words, a sensory diet to plan a lifestyle. Okay, and obviously that sensory diet is nothing to do with food. And me personally, I prefer using the terminology sensory plan, but obviously you might hear different use of terms from different people. But really what that is doing, it's providing bite-sized chunks of sensory activities at regular intervals throughout the day, okay, to support with regulation. And a sensory plan should be child-led, but for some young people they might be, as Zena's previously mentioned as well, that co-regulation stage. So they might need some support from the adults around them to provide the right activity with the right intensity at the right time for the right length of time. Okay, and initially that will be trial and error. So you just need to think about the strategies. What are you trying to do? And maybe write a list of those write a list of those alerting and calming activities. Okay, so sometimes just focusing on one area of difficulty, might be the morning, might be after school, might be meal times, whatever you struggle with, think about it. Think about the sensory systems. What are they sort of engaging in? Which sensory systems are they recruiting? What are they doing it because they like doing that sort of sensory behaviour, or do they dislike it? Are they avoiding something? You know, and really think about that calming and alerting and that list, what works, what doesn't. And then by using or trialling some sensory activities, you might be able to then take your child through that, you know, the arousal level that Zena was talking about. You could use those sensory strategies to move them through that arousal level. And one way of doing that is using a sensory ladder. So it fits in really nicely with what Zena was talking about before. And this is just one way of supporting a young person with their sensory needs, but it provides quite a nice framework for the young person as it's personal to them. It also helps provide a shared understanding between that person, home, school, and anybody else involved in their care, so any other agencies. So sensory ladders have been developed by an occupational therapist called Kath Smith, and it's built upon other self-regulation programs. So some of you might have heard about the ALERT program or the zones of regulation, and it's sort of a development of that. So with this sensory ladder, we have different stages. We've got a few more stages. So we've got that very under-aroused sleep stage, as you can see in that diagram. Then when you've got that sort of waking up, that under alert stage, then we've got that calm and alert stage, then we've got that over alert stage, and then we've got that shut down, that freeze stage at the top of there. Okay, and you can move yourself between that those stages. Okay, so using a sensory ladder provides opportunity to create discussions with the young person, if we're able to do that, or to create discussions with the person and their support staff or families around that person about their sensory needs and emotional states. And you can do this by using characters, objects, whatever they like, really, because it's personal to them. So there's an example here, and there is a website for sensory ladders that you can go to. So we'll put that in the chat, and there is actually some open access. It's like training really around sensory ladders that you can also access. But these are some examples, and I've used the cats with a young person because this young person, when she was stressed, would turn into a cat, and we would talk about what it would feel like at each of those stages, and then they can express what they look like, and then we would talk about, well, actually, when you're feeling like that, what makes you feel better, and then what can we use from a sensory strategy perspective, what can we use at each stage. And it's really helped to open those conversations, but also it's really helpful, for example, for school staff, for young person to say, well, actually, I'm feeling like that tetchy, scratchy cat today, and this is what I look like, and this is what I need to do to try and get me down to that nice, calm, purring cat. Okay, so you can use different characters. So for some young people, we've used Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore, Tigger for those different stages. You know, obviously there's a person there who's like tractors. Animals is a big one, but that people like to you know, express how they're feeling through animals. So there's an example there of, you know, when I'm an angry lion, this is how it impacts upon me. Or when I'm a jumpy frog, this is what I'm like. When I'm a happy horse, this is what I'm like. When I'm a tired tortoise, this is what I'm like. And then it's personal to that young person. So we will put that link in the chat, and it is worth having a look at that site and accessing the open access information as well. For there's parents, there's a section for parents and there's a section for professionals as well. Okay. Oop, just jumped a slide. Sorry, Zena.
Okay, so I'm aware we are over the finished time. So the last couple of slides really is to just kind of summarize everything that we've talked about. So this slide really just kind of summarizes one approach that you can have, which amalgamates everything that we've talked about. So thinking about when you're wanting to support your child, thinking about their environment, thinking about their activities, thinking about any equipment that might be useful for them, and then the approach. So we kind of touched on the idea of that co-regulation, helping them to be able to develop their own self-regulation abilities. So the environment, really, really important just to think about all the different environments that your child goes into. So we're talking about the home environment, the school environment, but also all of those other environments that they go. So the supermarket, any after school activities that they do, the swimming pool, all of those kinds of activities, environments, and think about putting on those sensory glasses and thinking about those environments in terms of the sensations that your child is maybe experiencing. And I think it's so I say this because I'm very under responsive. I don't pick up a lot of sensory information at all. So particularly smell, I don't pick up smell at all. And so I think it's really important to be aware of your own sensory needs, and the fact that just because you can't smell something doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a smell that your child can that might be impacting on your child. Just simple things like deodorant or aftershave that a teacher might be wearing that doesn't particularly bother you, or other adults or other people around might be impacting on your child. So just kind of having a little think about the sensory environment. We've touched a lot on those activities that really help to support the different sensory systems. So just a couple of examples there: trampolines, therapy balls, all of those heavy muscle work, proprioception type activities. The scooter are things kind of like skateboard type things that children can lie on that give lots of nice movement. And thinking about any equipment that might be useful for your child. So again, we touched on ear defenders and appropriate use of ear defenders, fidget toys. Some children like to pile loads of blankets and cushions on top of them. There are a lot of weighted products out there, and so the weighted products help with passive proprioception, but they do need to be used with caution. But in a very, very basic, simple approach, you could just think about those kind of wheat bags that go into the microwave. So you've got the nice warmth of these wheat bags, but there's also a bit of weight to them as well, and they can be really comforting and really helpful and provide that proprioception that some children might benefit from. And just at the bottom, RAG rating the sensory environment. I've done this quite a lot in some schools, particularly for those children who are really struggling during the school day. So getting a plan of the school, and you can do it for, draw up a quick plan of the house as well, and just ask your child if they're able to consider the different parts of the environment and colour those different areas in red, amber, green according to how those different environments help them make them feel. So for example, if you've got a child who the library is a green space for them and the classroom is a red space for them, then that helps the school to be able to understand where might be a good place for them to go for that kind of decompression, de-stress time. But if the corridor between the classroom and the library is a red or an amber, that also needs to be taken into consideration. So it's another way of helping the child to be able to communicate how they are feeling with their sensory environment. And really, again, just to kind of summarize just a couple of other things, because obviously we've talked a lot about our sensory system, but actually, like Justine said right at the very beginning, our sensory system is just part of a bigger jigsaw of things that are impacting on our children. So predictability is really, really key. Routine, structure, visuals, plans for the day, including those opportunities to de-stress. So some children do have particular activities. So I did a home visit the other day with a young man who was his de-stress is swearing, and he knows it's not appropriate, and he doesn't do it in school. he holds it together, and then he gets home and he has to swear. And his mum, and his mum's mortified because they are not a swearing family. She's like, I don't, it's awful. But she recognises that that's what he needs to do in order to de-stress and help his transition from a stressful school environment to a home environment. And so she allows him to sit in the car and swear because that's what he needs to do. And the fact that he knows that he can do that in that environment helps him with his day. Sorry, I skipped from the top one. So the top one is keeping calm yourself, being aware of your own sensory reactions. I have talked about that quite a lot. And I really like that quote. When little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm and not to join their chaos. And I think that's really, really powerful and a really important thing to remember. Again, we've kind of touched on is it working? Is it safe? Is it appropriate? Do we need to change what they're doing? Because if it doesn't need to change, then let's just allow them to carry on. If it's not safe and it's not appropriate, but it's working. So, for example, a child chewing their jumper, they obviously need to chew, but you don't want them to ruin their jumpers. So perhaps then we could then start thinking about getting them some jewellery or something that is more appropriate for them to chew. Watching behaviours, looking for clues, using those sensory glasses, taking some time to observe your child and the activities, and like Justine said, making those lists. What activity helps them to calm, what activities help them to alert, and what activities might be impacting negatively on them. Identifying those triggers, preempting a meltdown, try and reduce stress at the first signs rather than waiting for that meltdown. Thinking about that co-regulation leading to self-regulation. And it's really important. If you take away a child's chosen sensory strategy, they will replace it with something else. So if a child needs to move and they're swinging on their chair in the classroom and you try and stop them from swinging on their chair, then they will probably get up and start walking around the classroom, because if they need to move, they need to move. What we need to do as adults is to help them to gain that sensory input that they need in an appropriate and safe way. So what we can do is change the routine, the environment and ourselves, and education like this is the kind of starting point in how we can start to change how we approach supporting children with these sensory difficulties. And then the last couple of slides are just some kind of reading, further reading. So I think Alison can send that information in the supporting information following the session. So I hope that's been okay and useful.
Thank you both so much. That was really, really useful. I found it so interesting as well. I'm sorry that we've gone over everybody, but if I could just grab a few more minutes of your time just to wrap everything up. Just first of all, if you wanted to say thank you to Justine and Zena, please do in the comments. I will do a little feedback sheet, very, very brief afterwards, just to understand a bit more. But any immediate feedback would be great for them to see. And also want to say thank you as well to the parents and carers and other professionals who helped to co-produce and design this session. So thank you to everyone. I'm just going to very quickly share my screen and tell you then about the next steps. So, so first of all, as I've mentioned, we know that there are lots of gaps across Lancashire and Cumbria. So I can't give you specific answers to questions today. However, if you go to the SENDIAS service, they're always very, very helpful in terms of signposting and involving the correct colleagues. If you just Google SENDIAS and the local area where you are, then you will hopefully find the link and just phone them. And they have also good links with health colleagues as well. So they will be able to help you in terms of any individual questions. Parent carer forums as well, including the Lancashire South Cumbria reference group, although please note they're not support groups, but again, very useful to connect with other parents and find more information. As I've mentioned on the chat, the local offer, that will have lots of information and different services, and this is where the this presentation and video will be shared. So again, just Google your local area plus local offer. If you really need help, go to commissioners for whichever area you're in. and also Facebook groups. So we'll do a list for your individual areas for each of those things, so you can just easily click on them and know where to go if you need more help and information. The next steps. So as I've mentioned, all this information, the video, the slides, everything I've just talked about in terms of useful links will all be shared, emailed to you directly if you've registered, and also I will request that it gets shared on the local offer as well. We absolutely welcome other parents and carers, professionals, everybody to view this and use this information. We've got an engagement event which is planned on the 1st of December, and this is where we've had the education. So the next session will be, okay, let's now have a discussion and talk about what do we need to do, how do we fill some of those gaps, what would be helpful in us to move forward and develop a bit of a plan. And alongside that, with parents and carers, we're also engaging with partners. So it's really important that we get education on board and the local authority. So I'll be doing some more presentations around the importance of sensory and what we're doing here today with wider partners through SEND work. And what we hope to do at some point is to come to a bit of a pathway and develop an agreed response of what do we do in situations, who needs to have what training, how do we meet children's sensory needs. But as I mentioned in the introduction, that's going to be a very, very big piece of work. So really we're just starting that journey. So that's it really. Thank you so much for attending. I really hope that's been helpful for you. It's been really, really helpful for me, and it's just the start of the journey, I guess. And I'm sorry we didn't have time to do questions and answers, but we will collate some of those questions, and whether it's on the next session or email them out, the answers separately, I will go through. So you will have answers to some of those questions. So thank you, everybody. You're free to leave.